It's a busy night. It's a busy night tonight. When we were thinking about another event, we anticipated the Biden infrastructure plan being something that would certainly fascinate people in terms of what are people doing in terms of investing in the sector. And since we do them always on a Wednesday, it was in every 3-4 weeks or so, we picked tonight. And of course, it's Yom Ha'atzmaut, so appreciate a lot of people joining today, or maybe doing a split screen with another event that might be going on tonight. So thanks everyone for joining here tonight. A lot of very exciting things going on in the world at YU. I had a great board meeting today with Noam Wasserman at SciSims. You'll be hearing a lot of exciting things going on there, and certainly in the alumni network and the things that we've got going on. It's been certainly busy, but maybe not be doing, I think last year was 24 events, maybe about half that this year, but hopefully very topical and timely things. When Clive and I were talking about this infrastructure event and who we should get to talk about it, the first name that actually jumped to mind was an old friend, Jay Worenklein. Jay and I used to sit next to each other at the Jewish Center, across the aisle in the front. So it was really appreciate, Jay, you coming on and being part of this event. And Clive, of course, knowing so many people in the infrastructure world with the work that he's involved in, really has pulled together a great panel today for everyone to hear, not just about electric utilities, about water, about transportation. I think about $1 billion out of the $2 billion in the infrastructure plan is actual infrastructure. I think maybe there's different definitions that people will use for infrastructure for the other half of the program, but I think we're going to learn a lot about some of the great programs. So really looking forward to it. I think a lot of people are familiar with the housekeeping. You're all on mute. Please use the chat boxes. Assume over a year of COVID, everyone is familiar with how to go ahead and use chats to ask your questions. And we look forward to a great conversation, and hopefully in the not too distant future, maybe summer, maybe late summer or September, we'll start doing these again in person. But I don't think we'll ever give up this webinar format that allows so many people to participate. So with that, welcome everybody, and Clive, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Lawrence, and good evening to everybody. Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, happy Israel Independence Day. Lawrence, thank you for putting together these programs. They're really terrific. And Eliza and Jake, thank you for handling all of the logistics. As Lawrence said, when we first started talking about this program 2 or 3 months ago, we kind of had an indication that the Biden administration would put together something large in infrastructure. We obviously had no idea what it was going to be, or that it was going to be discussed literally on the day of this program. So this is a very hot topic. We have a really terrific program tonight with 3 highly experienced people in this space, and I'm really glad to know each one of them. Matt and I have known each other for several years now. We first met in Washington, DC, having dinner together at a conference where we were both speaking about infrastructure. Jay and I have known each other also for a few years, starting with a breakfast on the Upper West Side, discussing the same topic. And Frank and I have known each other for just a few weeks, but I've already learned a lot about him. The framework that's going to happen right now is I'm going to ask each of the 3 panelists to talk a little bit about themselves, their backgrounds, and the projects or companies that they run. And then I have a bunch of questions. And as was indicated, if you have any questions in the audience, please feel free to type them into the chat box. So Jay, I'm going to start with you. You're a pioneer in the energy power infrastructure space. Can you please talk a little bit about your background professionally and how it is that that led to your vision for the future of American power infrastructure?
Well, thank you very much for that compliment, which is not at all deserved, but I'll take it. I wish I could record it. Basically, I started out my career after law school. Actually, I should say, after Yeshiva University High School, I went off to college and then to law school and business school. And then I got a job in a law firm, Milbank Tweed. And I knocked on the door. The first day at the law firm, I knocked on the door of a new partner at the firm who had just joined the firm. His name was Robert Douglas. He was Secretary and Counsel to Governor Rockefeller, who had just announced he was not going to run for re-election. And I knocked on his door and I said, I'm Jay Worenklein, and I know who you are, and I would love to work for you. If you have any work, please call on me. And he said to me, well, that's so nice of you. He was so gracious. He said, that was so nice of you. He said, but you know, I just came to the firm today too. It's your first day, it's my first day. So I don't have any clients yet. And I did that, but he was so gracious. I did that the next week and he had the same answer, you know, not yet. And then a week after, but he was so nice about it. I did it one more time after that. And then he calls me and he says, we have a new client. And the client is the 7 electric utility companies of New York State. And they've hired us to create a joint venture of all the 7 companies who together would design, engineer, and build and own and operate all the future power plants in New York State, each one of the 7 companies buying their own pro rata share of the capacity and the energy of the power plant, so they would not have to overbuild and they just would buy exactly what they need, etc. And so he said to me, would you like to work with me on that? And I said, of course, I'd love to. So, but I tell you that story because it really showed me that there's no harm in nicely knocking on somebody's door and asking for what you want and seeing who's there and going for it. So it turns out I was the first Shomer Shabbos Jew at Millbank Tweed. And the first day in the office, I went to see the, I'm sorry for these diversions, I hope you don't mind, but I can't help it. But I went to the office of the head of personnel and I said, listen, I just want you to know that this September, there are 7 holidays, religious holidays that come out in the middle of the week. Thinking about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the first 2 days of Sukkot, the last 2 days of Sukkot, etc. So I'm going to have to take them off. Should I take them off as vacation days? I just want to know how I should account for it. He said, don't be silly. You're going to work so many Sundays and other days. You just keep track of it. The point was, you know, that it couldn't have been nicer. And Bob Douglas, who was Secretary and Counsel to Governor Rockefeller and very close to the family, the Rockefeller family, I'd sit in his office in December on a Friday afternoon, and he was a little antsy. And we would talk, and it's 2:30, and he's breathing heavily. And then it's 3 o'clock, and he's breathing heavily. And I say, Bob, what's wrong? He says, Jay, Shabbos, it's Shabbos. Shabbos is coming. He's a devout Roman Catholic, but he worked for Nelson Rockefeller, so he knew Jews. He said, it's not so important, go home. But the point of the matter is, so I worked on this project for the next 6 years. I was their counsel. I learned what there was to learn about utility companies, and I spent the rest of my career, including to date, either as a lawyer and then as a banker, running Lehman Brothers Project Finance Global Group, where I met Frank Sacr, who worked with me, and I was so pleased. And then I worked for Societe Generale for some years, and then I started my power company, U.S. Power Generating Company. We owned half of the generating capacity in New York, in Boston, and a quarter in New York City. And so I ran that for a number of years. Today, I'm the CEO of U.S. Grid Company, and we're trying to continue to do the things we have to do. The key issue in the power sector, I should say, is the following. Can we, in fact, maintain the lights on under every circumstance that we can face, as demonstrated in Texas and California? That's not as easily done as it is said. And it is so critical that we have reliable power. And that means that we have to have plants that are always available. That means maintaining them properly, but it also means that as we go into the clean energy transition, we need to maintain plants that are either nuclear or gas-fired or otherwise that have the capacity to be on in a moment, generating the power that's needed if the sun isn't shining for solar power and the wind isn't blowing for wind. And so that is my mission today, which is to essentially create the transition by beginning to experiment with hydrogen coming into gas-fired power plants. We can use a little bit of hydrogen. We can separate water into hydrogen and oxygen, start funneling it into the power turbines. We can capture carbon by sequestering it. There's so much to be done. And this infrastructure bill that we're talking about will create a massive amount of capital available for research and development, for the transition of mobility to electric mobility, and for fundamental research and development that's needed in order for this country to become effectively a clean energy company and to create technologies at a low enough cost so the world can adopt it at low enough cost so that we can have global reduction of carbon. And I'm probably taking over my time, but we have the United States only produces a small percentage of the world's total carbon, but we have to be the pioneers in developing the technology that it can help the world reduce its carbon. And with that, I think I may have said it enough, and I should shut up.
Jay, that was really inspirational. Thank you for sharing that. Frank, you've played over the course of your career a really pivotal role in some really serious infrastructure projects, perhaps none as critical as the one you're currently responsible for, perhaps especially for those of us in the Northeast. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background and about the Gateway program? And I know there are some slides, so Elise, I'm going to ask you to please load those slides as Frank begins his comments.
Clive, thank you very much, and thank you for having me speak and join this panel this evening. So certainly I've started in infrastructure in the 90s in Australia, working indeed for Société Générale. Down there, I was talked about Jay as a pioneer of the infrastructure industry. I can tell you that pioneer has brought many folks along with him, and he introduced me to the infrastructure sector in the United States. Brought me across in the late 90s, initially for a few years, but it's now 2021. Here I am. Downtown Jersey City, and so I've worked in the banking sector, involved in infrastructure, originally energy, and then more on the transportation, indeed a bit of water as well over the last 15 plus years. I said I worked for Société Générale for 23 years. And on airports, roads, bridges, tunnels, rail, you name it, and doing combination of lending and advisory and capital markets, typically on the private sector side. So always advising on the private sector side. And so I know we're going to come to it later, but public-private partnerships are something I've spent a lot of time on over my career. I worked on those projects, as I said, for 15 plus years. One of the last projects I worked on at Société Générale, actually in addition to a water project in Texas, was actually advising the consortium developing the new Terminal B at LaGuardia Airport. And so it's very heartening to see that well on the way to completion now. After that project, obviously, the lessor of that project is the Port Authority. I got to meet a lot of the Port Authority folk who are also involved in the Gateway project, and so I knew I wanted to do something a little different, and perhaps find a role on the public sector side. An opportunity came up for me to work for the Gateway Program Development Corporation, initially as Chief Financial Officer, and then as the interim executive director of Gateway Program Development Corporation, and here I am today. And that's actually probably a good intro to my slides about what attracted me to Gateway, and why is it so important. And I think what I say, we've got a slide up. If we look to our first slide, Gateway Program, most urgent in America. I'll wait for the slide to catch up to us. Oh, there we are. Oh, yes, there we are. And what attracted me to the project was that you only have to look at the photos of it, and I deliberately use this photo that you see in the right of screen there. That tunnel is 110 years old. And when you go down into it, this is the tunnel, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, but basically all of the Amtrak trains and New Jersey Transit trains coming from New Jersey and the Northeast Corridor into Manhattan go through these two tubes of this tunnel. And so 110 years old, badly affected by Hurricane Sandy in 2012, urgently needs replacement. And so the idea is the to build new tunnels and rehabilitate the existing tunnels to put four new tracks, effectively new tracks, into Manhattan. There's already one project underway that our colleagues at New Jersey Transit are working on for the development of the Portal North Bridge, and that's actually in procurement right now. It is a bottleneck right now in the entire Northeast Corridor, which is why it's such an essential project to get done. As I said, 450 trains a day, 200,000 trips per day in 2019, and as I said, a bottleneck that could severely affect the U.S. economy if one of the tubes had to be shut down for any extended period of time. But it's part of an overall program of which I'm talking about the tunnel the most. If we go on to the next slide for a second, it's important. It helps you with some of the geography of what we're looking at here. I mentioned the Hudson Tunnel project, which is where we spend most of our time. Portal North Bridge I mentioned as well. We have to build a concrete casing under the Hudson Yards complex approaching into Penn Station. That the platform for the western part of the Hudson Yards project will go over. And so they're the immediate near-term projects. We also have what we call some of our phase 2 projects, which are also frankly accelerating quickly, including the potential expansion of Penn Station. Obviously a huge project in its own right, and one that's in the news quite regularly, as well as further expansions along the corridor, with the ultimate goal of allowing extra capacity to come into Manhattan. If we jump to the next slide, please. The last thing I want to mention was just in terms of geography. I've mentioned there are 2 tracks today built by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and thankfully they built them very well. And they are still working as intended 110 years later. That is our white line that you see on the screen there, traveling from Secaucus on the bottom left of the screen, and up through Weehawken and under the Hudson River, and approaching into Penn Station. The new Hudson Tunnel project will parallel the existing tracks in Secaucus, New Jersey, approaching North Bergen, and then actually go under the Palisades of New Jersey there, really not even a few feet south of the existing tubes, under Weehawken, with the idea of a shaft in the Weehawken-Hoboken border, and continuing under the Hudson River, actually at a relatively shallow depth, and coming back up near the Hudson River Park, and on into underneath 12th Avenue, excuse me, another shaft at Block 675, which is 12th Avenue between 29th and 30th Street, and on into Manhattan. So of that project, we have, as has been publicly reported, we were stalled for a few years. It's definitely got a strong momentum right now, which is exciting. We publicly stated the other day, actually our federal partners updated the federal dashboard for environmental approvals, and we expect to have our environmental approvals by the end of May, which is a key stepping stone for the development of the project. Thank you, Clive.
Wow, Frank, that's a pretty amazing presentation. Thank you very much. What is the total announced budget for the project, by the way?
Yes, the total budget is today about $11.6 billion, of which about I should know it off the top of my head, shouldn't I? About 9.8 for the construction of the new tunnel, and $1.8 billion to rehabilitate the existing tubes.
So not a small project. Thank you very much. Matt, the hydrological cycle has been something that's been really affected so much by climate change. And this is something you really are an evangelist for: water infrastructure, water investing. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you so interested in water? And also maybe talk from a 60,000 foot level, what are the opportunities in water investing?
Sure, thanks, Clive. And it's a privilege to be on a panel with such highly experienced and esteemed speakers. So thank you very much for including me. Water, water's essential, obviously, and you know, just it's kind of interesting that it is the 50th anniversary today of Israel. Israel was very prescient about being mindful about how essential water is and was, and if they hadn't been as intelligent, mindful, and focused on ensuring water supply and water quality, that we wouldn't be celebrating the 50th anniversary today. So that's kind of an interesting and a pleasant coincidence for me to be here today for that. I got involved in water really about 20 years ago. I was a generalist fund manager, and really I've written research, bought and shorted almost every industry. And what happened was one of my old friends was in the water industry and was sort of acting as an industry contact. And I was buying water stocks as part of a general portfolio. And one thing led to another, and we ended up launching an acquisition for a large water utility together. And in doing that, we raised about $1 billion. We made a bid for this company, and we ended up actually not buying it because the seller kept raising the price, and we passed. But in the process of putting the deal together and raising the money, we met with some of the largest, most sophisticated pools of capital in the world. And what we felt was that we had a significant information advantage in terms of understanding the opportunities and the risks associated with the water industry. And I'd been pretty good for a long time at like digging in on an individual stock or an individual company, doing a lot of research and knowing the company better or as well as the management. And I took a step back and said, my goodness, this is an industry of an essential resource that is extraordinarily capital intensive, that's made up of monopolies and oligopolies with some of the most durable, inflation protected, steadily increasing pricing power of any industry I've ever seen. And the most sophisticated investors in the world barely understand it, and Wall Street barely understands it. And literally, I dropped everything I was doing and kind of relaunched and rolled the capital that I was managing, and we started Water Asset Management. And for the last 15 years, all we've been doing is investing exclusively in companies, assets, and stocks around the world of companies that ensure water quality and water supply. And over the last 15 years, we've developed a fairly significant domain expertise or experience by having invested in literally every imaginable sector of the water industry, which is made up of water utilities, as I mentioned, water and wastewater utilities, which we believe are some of the best business models of any on earth for long-term capital preservation, capital appreciation, and wealth transfer, as well as companies that manufacture pipes and pumps and meters and water concessions, desalination concessions, all different kinds of water-related technologies, whether it's media or labs on a chip, sensor technology, data gathering. There's a lot going on in agriculture. We invest in irrigation equipment. And then on our private equity side, we also have built a pretty substantial separate business that acquires farmland in the southwestern United States with water rights. And we then bring efficiency and transparency to those water rights. And we're able to arbitrage the value discrepancy between those water rights that are used on farms. And we only buy low value crop farms with the best water rights. So the best water, most senior water rights that have been used historically to grow hay, for example, or cotton. And then there's an arbitrage in bringing efficiency by fallowing and irrigation efficiency. And then that same water can be used to grow cities. I mean, I've got a picture behind me we use, which is Lake Mead, which is one of the two big reservoirs on the Colorado River. And the reason we have the picture, it's maybe a little hard to see, but there's a large bathtub ring around the lake, that white wall, so to speak. What that shows or signifies is that the reservoir has been structurally depleted. The level is very low because climate change has impacted hydrology, intensifying drought and flood in other parts of the world. But in the Southwest, it's drought. And so in order to maintain the same amount of water to the people downriver, the Bureau, what they do is they've been draining the reservoir. Well, you can only do that so long. And so we're actually getting paid by the federal government to fallow farmland with Colorado River water rights that we own and not use that water, not even allow it to go through the dam at Lake Powell, and actually keep it in the reservoir to benefit the system by increasing the level of water in the reservoir. So, I mean, we've invested in almost every imaginable water-related product. And by the way, we've done it in about 20 different countries. And what we've learned is that every water problem imaginable is solvable. There's a solution for every water supply and every water quality problem that we've ever seen, whether it's enormous or small. It requires three things: capital, will, and competence. And what we're doing and is providing that private capital in many different kinds of venues and circumstances, through both public equity investing as well as our private equity team investing in everything from, as I mentioned, water rights to water-related infrastructure to companies that provide the goods and services. Our core belief is that scarce, clean water is the resource defining the 21st century, much like oil and gas was the source that defined the previous century. And we happen to be one of the very few firms that is kind of fully dedicated to providing capital solutions and competence to the water industry.
Matt, thank you very much. It's so much bigger an industry than I think any one of us would have known otherwise. Frank, I'd like to turn to you. You've got a really fascinating career in that you've spent time in the private sector and now in the public sector. Very few of us really think about spending time during our career in the public sector. Can you talk about the career thoughts of somebody who might make that switch, maybe for a period of their time in their career and then go back? Talk a little bit about that, please. You're on mute, by the way, Frank.
I don't know how I did that. Thank you. Glad to. Thank you, Clive. Well, look, I think talking about myself, personally, first, I think I was keen to take some of the knowledge and experience that hopefully I've accumulated over my private sector career, and hopefully try to utilize that to help advance this project, but to also generally, one of the reasons I joined and I was invited to join was to bring private sector capabilities and competencies and expectations to the delivery of public infrastructure. And hopefully that's certainly been what I've been working on for the last few years. What I will hasten to say very quickly is that while I've certainly hopefully been contributing that, I've been learning a ton as well, and learning from some of the frankly some of the best and brightest people I've ever met, and all with a very different mindset perhaps than we're used to in the private sector. But trying to make sure that they doing more of a mission, if you like, versus perhaps financial rewards, but to do good for whether it's the community or the state or the country. And so I've learned as much, I feel, as I've provided to people, which is something I've certainly hoped to get out of this experience. I think the other thing I would say is that it is perhaps a little more unusual in our sectors, in the infrastructure sector generally, for this kind of activity that I've undertaken. But it's globally, this is not unusual, and I can tell you that when I left Société Générale, who were very good to me when I left the bank after 23 years. It was certainly, I would say, from a US perspective, like, well, people don't normally do that. It was like, what fund or what other bank or where are you going? I can tell you my French senior management at the time understood it immediately. And again, there's no perfect model anywhere, but certainly from a European perspective, that sort of cycling of talent, hesitate to put myself in that category, but of talent between private sector and public sector is considered more normal, and a good sort of cross-pollination of skills between the public and private sector.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Jay, I'd like to turn to you now. In thinking about the energy sector and power transmission, we all saw what happened in Texas earlier this year. You know, there was a project that was announced recently between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece to connect the grids of all of those three countries. I suspect they're kind of related topics. Can you please talk a little bit about grid resilience? It is, of course, something that the Biden administration has put into their current plans. Please.
Sure. Well, the Texas debacle was attributed by various parties in accordance with their own political predispositions. So people who hated renewables said, well, this was because the renewables were not reliable, and people who, etc. And the fact of the matter was that the real fundamental problem was the basics, which is when you're creating a resilient, reliable power system, you've got to, number one, maintain it. You've got to recognize that every day is not going to be the same as the day before, the day after. There could be storms. You've got to maintain them. You've got to weatherize your plants. These plants and their transformers and critical elements were not weatherized, were not maintained properly, and so they did not work. And so fundamentally, there's some very basic issues, which is you have responsibility, you've got to be incentivized. And actually in Texas, as a detail, companies are not incentivized for the maintenance of their power plants. They're incentivized by the amount of energy they're selling at any given moment. And supply and demand creates the price. And so if you're selling in a period of time where there's an excess of demand, you can get an extraordinary amount of money. And if there's an excess of supply, you can get very little, but you're not incentivized for keeping your power plant ready and available at a moment's notice to go full blast and dispatch, which is what you really have to do. So there are lessons to be learned about reliability, about inducements. What are the right incentives for government to provide to owners? And I think the whole system in Texas will change dramatically over the next few years to make sure they are incentivized. But the critical thing is that in an area of ESG focus, where we are so concerned about carbon reduction, we are so concerned about sustainability and of maintaining and leaving to future generations an earth that is viable and that is hopeful and that really supports life. In that kind of environment, you must have still a reliable source of power. In Hurricane Sandy, I happened to have the privilege of being chairman of the Ravenswood Power Plant in New York City, which is the largest power plant in New York City and New York State. That plant provided 50% of New York City's power alone because it was always maintained, always at the ready, large enough to do so. And it took care of the city. You've got to be able to do that. So my point is that, number one, listen, we're adults. We can do two things, right, at the same time. The two things we have to do is work hard to incentivize carbon reduction. And the Biden plan is fabulous in its ambition to do so. Now, a lot of people will criticize the plan because it also has societal issues, it has social issues, it's got money for, under the guise of infrastructure, we're going to take care of $400 million is dedicated to taking care of older people and disabled people in their homes. We, with the value that we have for so many of us, the value of taking care of people, we think that's perfectly reasonable. But a lot of people in the Republican ranks particularly will in fact oppose the bill because it's not truly an infrastructure bill. It's a societal wish list in the guise of infrastructure. And I'm concerned, but I think it's likely to be, and we should expect it, that there will be a negotiation in Congress between Republicans and Democrats, and President Biden has in fact invited it, to say, we've got to pass this bill. I'm open to hearing your objections. I'm open to think about taxes and how we're thinking about structuring our taxes to pay for this. I'm open to thinking about the scope of this. I'm trying to be ambitious, but I'm open to thinking about what will in fact be in the art of the doable. So the fact of the matter is, we've got approximately, I think the number is $150 billion or so of R&D inducements in this bill. That's critical so that people can find what is the right way to do this and drive down costs. So we've got to have every initiative to reduce carbon, to do it, and at the same time to keep our power system and our energy system reliable. We can do both things. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We've got to do it.
Thank you, Jay. By the way, if anyone is interested in the numbers of the Biden plan, Lawrence has just posted them into the chat box. Matt, I want to turn to you on another national debacle that is being addressed by the Biden plan, and that's lead pipes. You know, think back to Flint, Michigan. And can you just tell us a little bit about what is the state of piping in utilities across the country? Is our water safe? And is there an opportunity in this area for private capital?
Well, the lead pipe situation is one of a number of very widespread water quality related problems, but it's not limited to lead pipes. You know, for example, PFAS chemicals have been detected in virtually every water system, both municipal and investor-owned water system in America. And interestingly, the Biden administration has plans to hold those polluters finally accountable by declaring PFAS and regulating PFAS as a hazardous substance, which is going to create some very significant financial liability for those companies that for decades manufactured and improperly disposed of those chemicals. The lead pipe situation is actually plays a very prominent role in the water component of the proposed infrastructure bill. I don't know if anyone's taken a look. It's roughly half of the total $111 billion that's been earmarked or proposed to deal with water and water-related infrastructure. Most of that money is going to go to local construction firms, you know, got people with a backhoe, as opposed to, you know, sort of larger, you know, technology-oriented, water-related companies and businesses. So it's a, you know, it's being very sort of prominently addressed, and I think for the political reasons and all the press and media attention that Flint received, with, you know, good reason. We actually, Jay, just want to slightly push back a little bit on our view of the infrastructure bill as it relates to water, in the sense that, and I know both my co-panelists understand this, that what water in America needs is not 100 billion. Water in America needs literally hundreds and hundreds of billions because of the very dilapidated condition of so much of the infrastructure that conveys and treats water both before and after it's used. So this 100 billion is, I mean, it's a step in the right direction, but it's kind of a drop in the bucket. If you do the math and you sort of divide the amount of money by the number of citizens, by the way, it's over 8 years. So you take the 100 and whatever it is, 12 billion divided by 8, divided by 300 million, it's like $40 per American per year. It's like giving each American a Brita filter every year and telling them, okay, we've solved water. I mean, it ain't doing it. And that's why we believe that there needs to be a much more prominent role for private capital, which is enormous, available, and willing to finance all forms of infrastructure here in the US. And it's kind of interesting that, you know, when you read the Wall Street Journal or talk with, you know, anybody on Wall Street, I mean, everybody's focused on government solving and financing and funding these problems. Infrastructure is a big problem, but it's a unique problem in that it is a potentially and conceptually a highly and happening all over the world, financeable using private capital, or at least having private capital play a role. And one of the policy initiatives that we've been advocating is the creation of a development corp. So it's, people talk about an infrastructure bank. We're more for a development corp that's along the lines of the Reconstruction Corp that was created by the US in the 30s and existed through the 50s, or like OPIC, for example, which is now called DFC, but it's a bank in kind of in name only. And really what it primarily does is it creates, and this is what we think would be very helpful, is to create a set of rules and regulation that it can be used by cities and states that own infrastructure, the users of that infrastructure, and then private capital. So it's like a language and a set of rules and common principles that can be like a point of departure for discussions between those three parties. It's almost like, the idea is almost like to create a mirror entity of like state PUCs. Public utility commissions have been arbiters of hundreds of billions of dollars of capital pretty effectively between infrastructure, investors, regulators, and ratepayers. And the idea is to create sort of a mirror entity, organization, and set of rules. And in this case, it would be between cities and states and other government agencies that own infrastructure, and then private capital, and then the users of that capital. Because the users are paying. I mean, we're all paying either through taxes or through user fees, and the idea is to sort of corral and channel that capital in a way that goes directly to that infrastructure and then is able to provide a fair enough return. We're all about full cost pricing. What we've seen in some of the most unsuspecting places in the world, at least in water, is that when a utility, in our case, water and wastewater utility services, are priced appropriately so that all of the costs are covered, and those costs being the molecules themselves, the maintenance of the capital equipment, the expansion of that capital equipment, the operational expenses associated with running that capital equipment. And when the tariffs are set that cover all those costs, including interest and a return on that equity, you've got potable water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and everybody wins. And so we're big believers in that concept and the ability to apply that to what is the biggest emerging market on earth, which is infrastructure here in America that needs trillions and trillions of dollars. More government debt is, in our opinion, is not the only solution. The idea of creating an environment where private capital can and wants to participate, we think would be very beneficial.
If I could mention, is not true. It's not uniquely an American problem either. That this almost like acting as like a champion or an incubation of projects. Other countries are trying to do this as well, and it's with different levels of success. And whether it's sort of local champions, whether an Infrastructure Ontario or a Partnerships Victoria, or basically bringing together all of the various government arms in a region to then, frankly, encourage and promote particular infrastructure developments in their regions. And one of the things that hasn't really got a lot of press yet in the Biden American Jobs Plan, but I actually take quite a bit of heart from, and I think actually Clive goes to one of your earlier questions, that they focus on, what can we learn as a nation from around the world, and they mention Canada, UK, Australia, perhaps with similar political and safety systems, to deliver projects on time and on budget, because Matt's quite right with regard to sort of the full cost, basically making sure that you've got full costing of infrastructure. But a fundamental question that I'm seeing again and again on mega projects around the world is, what is the cost, and how do you deliver those projects as efficiently as possible? Because I can tell you, mega projects don't have a good name. That they're typically late, they're typically over budget, and one of the challenges to with the whatever your definition of infrastructure might be, and frankly, people have been arguing about that for as long as I've been in the sector. But getting the maximum bang for your buck is a hugely important issue to give the population and taxpayers comfort that dollars are being spent efficiently.
Frank, thank you. Jake, can I change topics a little bit? There's a book that if anybody is really interested in, I don't know if you can see it on the screen because of the background, but this is Bill Gates's book on climate change. And in it, he talks about something that you touched on very briefly, which is nuclear, the role of nuclear and gas. But I want to specifically ask about nuclear because it's viewed as controversial, and yet there are some really innovative ideas in nuclear. What is the future role for nuclear in our power mix?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Nuclear has such a bad name, and people are so frightened in the aftermath of Fukushima and other disasters that we've experienced in the world. And yet the very promising part of the nuclear story is the development of new technologies. So people like Bill Gates and others have supported what's called small-scale modular nuclear reactors. These are reactors that instead of 1,000 megawatts would be 20 megawatts each, or 40 megawatts. But you can add 10 of them to a site, so you can get 400 megawatts. But each unit is very small and is wrapped up in sufficient enclosures, etc., so that even if there's a problem in that small module, that can be captured and kept inside the machinery as opposed to getting out of the machinery. So you can actually put together 20 modules or 40 modules or whatever you need on a large enough site and be protected. Now that technology is going through licensing proceedings right now before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. One of them, manufactured by NuScale, the NuScale technology, will in fact be deployed and put into service in Utah in 2027, 2028. And we will see some real life experiences with nuclear reactors of that size coming off an assembly line. I mean, the beauty is that it's not a tailor-made job. You don't have craftsmen or craftswomen inside a reactor and making a mistake and doing something wrong and not tying the bolt right, etc., or looking at plans and doing it backwards, as has happened at some nuclear reactors in the past. On an assembly line, you have some quality control protections. And the point of the matter is that nuclear plants can be available 24 hours a day, and they will in fact save the system, whatever happens to the system, so that they are the base load and they're clean energy. There is zero carbon. So when those assets are in fact protected, when they come online, they're demonstrated and there are no accidents, in the same way that nuclear submarines, American Navy nuclear submarines, land in New York City Harbor or in San Diego Harbor, and nobody thinks twice about it. They're as safe as can be. They have not had accidents. So my hope is, my dream is, that with the evolution of these small-scale modular nuclear reactors, we will have a baseload facility that is zero carbon, that is controlled in cost because of their assembly line manufacture, which will in fact become the anchor of reliability for the power system some decades from now, so that we can actually shut down all fossil fuel power plants, knowing that we now have a baseload, reliable, zero carbon plant that's completely reliable.
That's very inspiring. Thank you. Frank, I want to go to something you talked about earlier, which is this idea of learning from other countries. So you're an Australian. One thing that Australia is very famous for in infrastructure is asset recycling. Can you please tell the audience what that is all about?
I'll certainly do my best. Full disclosure, I've been in America for 22 years now, more. But it's quite simple at its base, and the way it developed there and can apply elsewhere is that there was encouragement from the federal government for the states to lease or otherwise privatize assets that they owned, existing assets that they owned, whether they were ports or roads, whatever it might be. And then they received a top-up from the federal government on top of the proceeds to redeploy for construction of new infrastructure. And so there was that encouragement and that incentive to the states to essentially bring in private sector to operate and manage and control assets, and then redeploy those proceeds for new roads and airports and bridges in Australia. So that's the model there. They have tried to export it elsewhere, and it was very much a flavour of the month in this country 3 or 4 years ago. Lots of Australians wandering around marketing. I'd run into them all the time in Manhattan, when you could run into people in Manhattan wandering around. I think that there are a lot of similarities between the countries. There's also a lot of differences, frankly. And one of the key differences is that in Australia you have a very strong central federal government, and you have 6 states and 2 territories, and that's it. Here you've got obviously a strong federal government, but also a strong devolution of power to 50 states. And each state is responsible for its own infrastructure to a large extent, and that's certainly encouraged. And there are a multitude of authorities responsible for the control and development of assets in those states. So, if you like, what worked in one country doesn't necessarily work here to the same extent. But some of the lessons in terms of whether they wish to encourage, and these are all policy decisions of which, frankly, I don't really have a view. But if there is a desire for a particular region to be able to sort of recycle its capital that it has in one particular asset into another form, that it shouldn't be discouraged. And I think that's perhaps one of the questions, for policymakers, as to whether how easy it should be for states and regions to do that.
That's great, thank you, Matt. I want to ask you a question. My own brother-in-law is a water engineer, and he works for an Israeli water engineering company that does projects all over the world. The global population is projected to be 10 billion in 2050. It seems from what you're saying that we're not going to have enough water in the future for everybody. Can you talk a little bit, very briefly, about water as a diplomatic tool?
Well, it's a favorite subject of mine, in that hydro diplomacy is the cheapest form of creating goodwill and is dramatically underutilized by our government. And there's a lot of opportunity to increase it, is the bottom line. I mean, just think about like what might have been if the drought, that the kind of structural drought that occurred in Syria, which drove the agrarian population to the cities of what was already a failed state, had been anticipated, and and water resiliency had been provided prior to that happening. I mean, we might have avoided a very, very tragic period of recent world history. And that applies, that's applicable to many other parts of the world right now. Most of that incremental population growth, as I know is actually coming from in Africa. And but there are lots of places in Africa that actually have pretty reasonable water access and water supply, and many more that don't. So the idea of being anticipatory around providing reliable and resilient water infrastructure and water supply in places like that is, I mean, that's cheap money, to do that before, you've got an overburdened system and then people migrating. Look, drought and flood, let me back up. Climate change is bad because of its impact on the water cycle. The first negative implications of climate change is intensification of drought and flood. And there's just not enough mind share, capital allocation, and policy focused on that fact. I mean, look at the Biden administration. Big focus on climate change, and like everybody else, it's primarily focused around renewables, which are important, electric vehicles. It's all carbon reduction. That's mitigation of climate problems for the future. Okay, right now we're experiencing drought and flood intensified at levels that we've never seen. I mean, the Colorado River, for example, just behind me. And by the way, we look at this all over the world, so we see this like in real time. The Colorado River is at stress levels that basically it's never seen before. And that's not unique. Taiwan is having the worst drought that they've had in measurable time. It's the first time since 1960 that no typhoon has made landfall in Taiwan. So you got Taiwan Semiconductor, which is one of the most critical suppliers of an essential product of any company around. They're trucking water into their fabs in Taiwan. They're paying farmers to fallow farmland in order to get access to water. So, water needs equity and equanimity with renewables. Renewables is climate mitigation. Water is climate adaptation for the world we have now, like it or not. And we need a more balanced capital allocation, mind share, and policy initiative around that, or we're going to have problems. And by the way, if you don't mind, I'd actually like to ask a question to both Jay and Frank, because I know they both have lots of experience around energy. And this is a question that I like to ask, which is, everybody knows we need between 11 and 30 trillion, depending upon who you ask, of low carbon, no carbon energy in order to prevent the planet from warming the incremental 2 degrees. Those are kind of directionally the numbers. And we've invested, I don't know, I've never actually seen the right number, but it's $1 trillion or something in renewables. The returns on that $1 trillion, some have been good, but not all of it. And as we continue to add more and more renewable capacity, and Jay, I'm sure you're right on the modular nuclear, but the point I want to make is that if the price per kilowatt hour keeps going down and the cost per kilowatt hour of generation keeps coming down, it's like, how do you charge for that incremental kilowatt? And at some point, is electricity going to be in such surplus and priced to the point where people are going to be looking at each other and say, okay, we've put up 2 trillion. We need another 18 trillion or whatever the numbers, but I'm not going to do it because I'm not getting a return. And then what? And I bring this up because water is the exact opposite. Water is scarcity. Water is investing in scarcity versus, facing some of the supply issues around electricity. And I just wonder, what do you guys think about that? I mean, is that something that...
Matt, I'm sorry to cut you off here. We're actually running out of time. So what I'm going to ask, if Jay and Frank want to just make some final comments, maybe addressing Matt's question or just some final comments in general for the audience, just a couple of minutes and then we'll wrap up. Jay, why don't we start with you, please?
Sure. Matt, I think your point is so critical. And I would just say that the issue of adaptation, of climate adaptation for rising water levels, including in New York City. I just heard the mayor's head of the Office of Resiliency just give a talk about that as to what New York City needs to do. And you're right. The other point is you don't have to deal with carbon reduction solely by changing the production means. You can also sequester carbon, and that's a wholly separate issue. But I just want to say to you that I think your point is We've got to have carbon reduction in terms of mitigation for the future. We've got to have also investment in mitigation. And I love what you said about how water could play a role in terms of creating peaceful relationships among countries. And it's really a fabulous diplomatic weapon. You should be in the State Department running it right now.
Frank, final comments?
I'm not sure I'd pass the background check.
Well, for Matt's good question, I'd say, certainly finding ways to reward capacity is crucial, and whether it's energy or any other space, that's very very important. And I think also, and Matt touched on this earlier, and I know Jay has spent time on this as well, is the demand side management side in terms of what is, how high, to your point, how high does the bar have to be? Because we are not a very efficient planet, and there's a lot can be clearly. We have to build the infrastructure, but we have to also use what we're using more efficiently, and that's where I'm hoping technology can help as well, in terms of whether it's congestion management or faster transport, whatever it might be, and to find ways to use what we've got better.
That's great. Thank you. That is exactly the message. I want to thank everybody for what it was really a terrific panel. We could have gone on for another hour. I hope if there's anybody in that administration who's watching this, there's so much you could learn as this topic is being discussed and debated in Washington. With that, I'm going to thank you all and hand it over to Eliza.
Thank you so much, Clive. Thank you to all of our panelists. It was so interesting to hear about this topic and this conversation. And I definitely think that if there weren't conflicting events worldwide tonight, we would have definitely had a larger crowd. And I would love to see this conversation happen again.